Hey there, I'm Ari from the TechWise Guru, and I'm very excited to be bringing you another product review here on the channel today. What we've got here are actually 4 CPU coolers, and this is going to be a shootout review. So any one of you who've seen my previous CPU cooler reviews, you know that I don't just take one CPU cooler and say, hey, here are the pros and cons, and thanks for watching. I actually take the best coolers I can find at any price point or in a size class, and I say, you know what? These are all nice, but I'm going to put them to the test. I'm going to run them through the gamut, and I'm going to tell you which one to buy. And that's what the goal of this cooler shootout is. Now, rather than taking, say, the best 120 millimeter coolers, or the best 140 millimeter coolers, or the best liquid coolers of this size or that size, what I've decided to do is actually make this a price-sensitive test. And what I did was I went to 4 of the biggest CPU cooler manufacturers in the world, and I said, you know what? I'd like to do a shootout that finds the best $100 cooler on the market. So send me your best cooler under $100. I'm going to throw it into this roundup and we'll see how it does. And all 4 manufacturers came back at me with their best sample. And that's what we've got up here on the bench today. So from my left to right, we've got the brand new Noctua NH-D15 Chromax Black. This is the long-awaited black version of the NH-D15, which was already Noctua's best cooler, and also arguably the best air cooler on the market. Now there's only one cooler that could challenge the Noctua NH-D15, and that is the Dark Rock Pro 4 from Be Quiet. Like the NH-D15, it's a dual tower, dual fan cooler. Now this is not a brand new design, but it is Be Quiet's best cooler, so that's what they came up with. And this is a $90 cooler versus the $100 Chromax Black. Then right up in front of me is also another brand new cooler. This is the Arctic Cooling Liquid Freezer 2 280 millimeter edition. So they have this in a number of different sizes, but when I said I want the best cooler under $100, this is what came up, because this comes in at $95. Typically under $100, even like a year ago, all you'd get is like a 120 millimeter cooler. This is a much more powerful cooler. It's going to be really interesting to see if it lives up to its specs, which suggests that it is a very, very capable cooler. But it's not alone in this race in terms of having liquid cooling. We also have SilverStone's brand new Permafrost 240. Now SilverStone was one of the biggest names in liquid cooling earlier in the decade. They kind of laid low for a while, but they decided to come back with a brand new design. This is the Permafrost line, or the PF line. Of course, as you can see from the box, they've added RGB. And so this is actually $100, and this is their best cooler under $100. Now, it is a 240 millimeter cooler, so right off the bat we know that maybe it's going to be at a disadvantage versus this 280 millimeter model. So it will be an interesting showdown, and I'm looking forward to the results. Next up, let's take a close look at what you get inside the box with each of these 4 coolers. All right, I've got my system prepped and ready to go for the installation of the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4. Now in typical Be Quiet fashion, we have some nicely organized part sets, as well as an entire assortment of instruction manuals in every language you could think of. What we've got: English, Polish, French, German, Spanish, and Russian. So they're very, very comprehensive, but you know I'm going to be tossing 5 of those and just keeping one of them. So at least that means you don't need as much space in your file folder. All right, other interesting thing I'll point out, you get a screwdriver with a magnetic tip, which is actually pretty useful in a lot of situations. I'm guessing this is actually required in order to insert screws all the way through the body of the cooler. So I don't think they include that just to be nice. You get just like a thumbnail-sized bit of thermal paste at the end of that tube. So that's probably good for just one application. Most manufacturers probably provide a bit more than that. And by the way, this splitter is here. This is a PWM splitter for the 2 fans installed in the cooler. If you only have one fan header on your motherboard, you can just use the splitter and attach both of your fans and control them with one header. Interestingly, I should point out that these are actually 2 different fans. The front fan is a 120 millimeter fan, and the middle fan here is a 135 millimeter fan. I think the main reason that Be Quiet does this is to provide a little bit more clearance for RAM. So we'll see how that works out. If you had a really big fan out here in front, it would hang down quite low, and would get in the way of a lot of stuff. I have a feeling this is still going to be getting in the way of the RAM I have in the system, which is Dominator Platinum RGB from Corsair. It's pretty high profile stuff, so I don't know how it's going to fit around this fan, or underneath that fan, I should say. And sure enough, it does not fit. I cannot use my Dominator Platinum RGB RAM. I'm going to be switching to this Vengeance RGB RAM you see on the left for all the installations and all the coolers. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning of the trouble I had with the Be Quiet cooler. First, you have to remove your video card because the fan installs from the side, not from the top, due to that decorative panel on top. Then you have to get these fan clips on, which I found incredibly difficult. They're much stiffer and harder to work than any other fan clips I've used from any other manufacturer. They don't have a handle to pull on with your thumb or finger. Even in the front, I found them very challenging. As you can see, they're very fiddly, extremely tight tolerance, which sounds good, except you risk breaking a nail every time you try to install the fan. All of this combined with the fact that the bracket had the most pieces by far of any of the coolers in this roundup made the Be Quiet installation by far the most challenging of the four. Still, once it's installed, the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4 may just make you forget all about the hassle that it was to install because it looks so great. Given the experience though, I was wondering how the Noctua NH-D15 would fare. It is quite a bit bigger than the Be Quiet, but notice that those fan clips have little notches for you to pull on. That was a hint that it would be easier to install. As always, Noctua is very thorough in terms of what you get in the package. Here are all the mounting components for the Intel bracket. You have the backplate pre-assembled with the pins through it. You have a case badge to decorate the interior or exterior of your system. You have a fan splitter so that if you don't have sufficient motherboard headers for the two fans that this cooler uses, you are all set. You get two low noise adapters which reduce the voltage to the fans in case you want to prioritize noise over performance. And then you get a tube of NTH1. That's not a full tube, but it's enough for several applications. This is the instruction manual for the Intel 1151 system that I'm using. You also get a separate manual for AMD and then the high-end desktop from Intel. As it turned out, like the Be Quiet, the Noctua required that I use my Vengeance RGB RAM as opposed to my Dominator Platinum, but that's the only thing it had in common. It was extremely easy to install, taking less time than any other cooler. Next up, I'll go over the two liquid coolers in this roundup. All right, we're ready to install the SilverStone PF240 liquid cooler. Overall, I was fairly impressed with the package that SilverStone's put together, pretty well laid out. Note that the manual is only in the form of an online manual. There's no manual in the box, and that's a little bit of a problem with a cooler that's as complicated as this liquid cooler and has all the ARGB features that this cooler has. You're going to need to refer to the manual. You do get a tube of SilverStone thermal paste that looks like to be good for 2 or 3 applications. And again, you do have a lot of wires you have to deal with. This bundle over here is something I'm not even going to touch. That's if you don't have an ARGB compatible motherboard. Honestly, I wouldn't even bother installing this cooler in a system that doesn't have full ARGB compatibility, and I'm using an Asus board. And that Asus board is going to have that plug that I need to get full motherboard sync control. Here is the Permafrost 240 installed. It's running through its rainbow cycle default color scheme. You can see that the individual LEDs in the fans and the cooling block are actually lit in different colors at any given moment, and that is the power of ARGB. One problem I found is that when I tried to sync this up with my Asus motherboard when running standard RGB components like the Corsair RAM shown here, it would default the entire system to RGB, which means I lost the ability to control or see individual LED colors in that permafrost cooler. This is the effect you'd get where it simply cycles through colors like a standard RGB component. Not quite as impressive. One last thing I should mention is that the cooling block has a mirror finish, so when it's off, you can see your own reflection in it. Now it's time to talk about the Arctic installation. Luckily, I determined way ahead of time that this radiator and fan combination measuring 38mm plus 25mm was too thick for just about any case. Luckily, my Cooler Master H500P mesh case had just enough clearance thanks to the special cutout for large radiators. You can see those motherboard mounting points there. In most cases, the radiator would actually strike the motherboard, making it impossible to install. In this case, I had a few millimeters of clearance around those motherboard mounting points and therefore the motherboard heat sinks. All right, getting ready to install the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 280. So far I am very, very impressed with what you get in the box here. Everything is pre-assembled. These fans came installed from the factory. I pulled this out of the box like that. That's the first time I've ever seen an all-in-one with the fans pre-attached. That saves you a few minutes right there. I love the braided housing here for these tubes. It looks really high end. It looks very serious, very professional. There's only a single cable that I'm going to need to attach for the motherboard. That makes things simple so that you don't see any of the mess of wires or cables that some of the other coolers had. Everything is pre-assembled. All of the fans, the pump, everything is powered off of this one connector, which actually kind of shocks me. Now, like the SilverStone and unlike the Be Quiet and Noctua, you don't get a manual, you get a QR code. But what's really cool about what Arctic has done here is that the manual is actually animated. So here's what it looks like. So you punch in whatever socket you have, so like Intel 1150X, which is what I have here. It gives you illustrated instructions. This is an improvement over a written manual. This is using the technology of a smartphone to your benefit. It's not just saving them paper and saving them costs. I love the animations here. It really helps you understand how to install everything. So kudos to Arctic for taking the next step and making an animated instruction set via smartphone. Two things I don't like about what I get here in the package. I'm just going to point them out. The rubber washers that are used to protect your motherboard from short circuits are just really plastic stickers, and these are not very reusable. So when I install this and then go to take it off and put in a new system, these may lose their adhesion and maybe I won't even be able to use them again. So that's a problem. The other thing is you get this dinky little packet of MX4 thermal paste. This is the only cooler of the four in the round that didn't come with a syringe that would make it so much easier to apply. Now, Arctic did send me a nice big syringe of their brand new MX4 2019 edition, but guess what? I'm not going to use it. Sorry, Arctic. Thank you for sending it. No, I'm not going to test it. This didn't come in the box, and therefore it's not part of the product. This is an additional $10 or so, and while I have no doubt it's a fairly good product, it didn't come in this box. It didn't come with this cooler. I'm not going to test it with that cooler. I'm going to test this cooler with the dinky little packet of MX4 that it came with. And I've used these before. They're very hard to apply, and it's just always a mess using those. So I don't like that, but those are the only two issues. Otherwise, you can see everything is pretty simple, straightforward. There's no RGB here. There's no dual fans that you have to connect or attach. They're all attached already. And of course, you can't miss that 40mm fan built into the cooling block for additional VRM cooling. Now, while this cooler barely cleared the motherboard in this installation, in the end, it was actually quite easy to install, and it looks fantastic. It reminds me a lot of the really high-end coolers from EK and Swiftech. And now for the moment you've all been waiting for, we're going to get into the benchmark results. But first, a quick shot of all four coolers in this side-by-side comparison. First up, the idle benchmarks with my Intel Core i9-9900K. One cooler sticks out like a sore thumb here. It's the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2280. The RPM level on those fans was maxed out the entire time, so it would not drop down at idle. It was simply too loud, and that's despite the fact that its built-in PWM controller is supposed to control those fans for you. From my point of view and in my testing, this did not occur. That thing was running at full RPM throughout the test. I'm going to loop back to this in a moment because I did find a way to modify this, and I'll show you the results. But first, let's take a look at the CPU-Z benchmarks. Now, this test is one that I view as close to a gaming engine as you can get. It stresses the CPU, but not extremely. So I think that this is the kind of temperature you'd see on a CPU in a game engine. Here we see Be Quiet really struggling on this overclocked 9900K 8-core processor. It's at 83 degrees. Just a step ahead is the SilverStone, which is 81 degrees and a blaring 40 decibels. It's really reaching its limit. The Noctua performs very admirably, hitting 76 degrees and just 30 decibels, meaning it's virtually silent. Now the Arctic actually beats it at 75 degrees, but again, because its fans are maxed out due to the faulty PWM controller, it's at 37 decibels, making it nearly as loud as the SilverStone. Now let's turn to a truly extreme benchmark. This is Cinebench R20 with AVX enabled. This is incredibly stressful on a CPU and a cooler. You can see the Be Quiet and the SilverStone are at their limit. In fact, the Be Quiet was past its limit. That 44 decibel sound level you see is actually the case fans kicking in because the motherboard sensed a critical temperature had been reached. So the Be Quiet was basically overwhelmed with heat. It could not cool the CPU. The SilverStone didn't quite reach critical temp, but it was still very loud. That 43 decibels is all its cooler and its pump, the fans. It's a very, very loud cooler when under duress. Now the Noctua and Arctic are nearly tied here. Again, the Arctic is at 37 decibel. It's locked there because of its faulty PWM controller. But here it does seem to win out because it is a little bit cooler, and the Noctua does get pressed up to 35 decibels in this test due to the load of Cinebench R20. Now let's take a quick look at one variation on that extreme test. Here I set all the fans to maximum RPM from the start. The Arctic doesn't change since it was already running at maximum RPM, and the Be Quiet doesn't change because it was really overwhelmed. But the Noctua changes significantly. It jumps up to 1400 RPM right from the start, and that means it's able to keep that CPU down at 81 degrees, beating the Arctic. But those fans at 1400 RPM are quite loud, so it hits 38 decibels, 1 decibel higher than the Arctic. Also note that the SilverStone does a little bit better in this test because the CPU doesn't heat soak quite as much. When those fans are started at maximum RPM, it stays down at 86 degrees instead of hitting 87 degrees where it's allowed to slowly ramp up on its own. So what about those mods to the Liquid Freezer 2280 that I mentioned? Well, I determined that the PWM controller was not adequate. It simply wasn't controlling the fans. So what I did was directly connect the fans to the motherboard using the splitter that came with the SilverStone PF240. That meant that the power lead that goes down the housing here and directly to the cooling block was no longer in effect. Now I had complete control over those fans via my PWM controller on the motherboard, just like it did with all my other coolers. The other thing I was skeptical of was the quality of the MX4 thermal paste that came in this little packet. It was hard to apply, and frankly, it's not as good as other pastes, so I went ahead and applied Noctua NTH2. And the results speak for themselves. At idle, the Arctic was extremely quiet, coming in at just 29 decibels or 1 decibel higher than the Noctua NH-D15. Notice that the temperature doesn't change much. Actually, it's a little bit hotter with the NTH2, but frankly, that's not relevant at idle. So let's move on to the CPU-Z benchmark. Now there's two stories to tell here. When we just engage PWM control over those fans and don't allow them to run at max, well, frankly, the CPU gets hotter with the Arctic because it's not running as fast. But the good news is it's not quite as loud at 34 decibels. Still, it loses to the Noctua. So simply adding PWM control does not allow it to gain an advantage on the Noctua. But how about PWM control and actually decent thermal paste? Well, now we see some really good results. It ties the Noctua in terms of thermals, and it's just 32 decibels, which is very quiet for a liquid cooler. Now here we see in the extreme Cinebench R20 benchmark that actually engaging PWM control does not help. It gets just as loud because it hits the maximum 1525 RPM, but it takes longer to get there, and so that CPU heat soaks and hits 84 degrees. I have a feeling this is why Arctic hasn't engaged PWM control in this cooler. But if PWM control alone wasn't going to allow the Arctic to get ahead, better thermal paste was. In this extreme heat situation, it beats the Noctua by 3 degrees and hits the very same noise level, 35 decibels, leading to a true win, the first true win for the Arctic. Better performance in all regards. All you needed was better thermal paste. And this is my message to Arctic. That little packet of MX4 is just no good. It's not worthy of a $100, 280 millimeter liquid cooler. Send your coolers out with a better thermal paste and you'll get better performance. But in this heavyweight title fight, it's not about what could be, but about what is. While I went in thinking that the liquid coolers would have an advantage, it didn't come to pass. The one and only true winner of this heavyweight matchup was the Noctua NH-D15 Chromax Black. It delivered on all counts. It looked great thanks to the blacked out trim of the heat pipes, the base, the accessories, and the fans. It was easy to install, taking me less time to get in my system than any of the other three coolers. And most importantly, it delivered performance in spades, getting both the lowest temperature results and the lowest noise levels. And that means it takes the crown for the best cooler under $100. Congratulations to Noctua on a win, and thank you to all of you for watching this video. If you liked it, please do like and subscribe. Feel free to post your comments down below, and I will catch you next time.